morning to you all. I'm very honored to share this virtual room, this panel with great specialists. It's the third panel of the third day of the first seminar of Tax and Sustainable Development. It's an independent initiative from some groups, women in tax, women that decided to host this event. So I thank you all for being here today. It's an honor. I hope we have a second seminar next year, and you all will be invited again. So, but let me just get started now because my English is not that good, and I'm only here to introduce Daniel Jott, that is a very, very close friend of me. And this panel will talk about the 13th SDG, the 13th goal of the 2030 UN agenda. That it's related to climate action. And this panel and the whole event is related, is about the relation between tax and the sustainable development. And this panel is about tax and the climate action. So we all hear the specialists in the panel, and I will just introduce Daniel and stop my participation here today. So Daniel is, like I said, I have a cat that's here. Daniel is PhD in tax and public finance at University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. He is a National Treasury Attorney, President of the IDT of Juiz de Fora, and Professor of Tax Law and Public Finance. He will be the moderator, the presenter of this panel. And so Daniel, you can start. Thank you very much for being here today.
Good morning, Nina. Good morning, Professor Allenson, Professor Elizabeth, Professor Tarcísio, and our audience of this first Congress on Taxation and Sustainable Development. It's a great pleasure for me to be the chairman of this board, and so I will explain how we're working for this hour and a half. First, Professor Elizabeth will make her presentation for about 20 minutes, then Professor Allison, and then Professor Tarcísio Diniz. We hope we have about 20 minutes for we can place the questions in English, preferable in the chat, and then we try to answer these questions. And the professors can ask for each other as you wish. And so, before I hand the floor over to Professor Elizabeth, who will speak about European Union proposals towards a green transition, I will summarize her curriculum. Elizabeth Gil Garcia is an assistant professor at the Tax Law Department of the University of Alicante, Spain. She received her bachelor's degrees in law and master's degree in environment law and sustainability with honors from the University of Alicante in 2012 and 2013, respectively. She finished her PhD under the supervision of Professor Amparo Navarro at the University of Alicante in 2016, with the additional title of the International Doctor and being awarded with the Doctoral Extraordinary Prize. So I give the floor to the Professor Elizabeth for about 20 minutes, and then we can Professor Allison can talk.
So thank you, Daniel, for the presentation. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Nina and Lidia Barroso. And I'm going to share some slides. So I think now they can. So I'm just wanted to do. So just 1 second, because I cannot find now where it's the.
Professor, I think you can open the slides and
Yeah,
then share the screen.
yeah, okay, now I think it's, because I have tried to do it with PDF, but I think it's better with PowerPoint. Yeah, so now I think you can see the slides. Yes, okay, perfect. So also, thank you to the organizers. And as Daniel, the moderator of the panel, has said, I'm going to, make a review of the EU proposals towards a green transition. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the European Union. So with the aim to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and to turn into a more resilient system for future crises, environmental taxation appears as one of the options to be explored at the same time that environmental related objectives are attained. So when we are talking about environmental taxation, we can distinguish a positive and a negative perspective. So from a positive perspective, we are talking about tax incentives to foster environment protection. So this may have a positive effect on taxpayers, but a negative effect on the tax revenue. And from a negative perspective, we are talking about environmental taxes. So this means they could be a way to generate new resources, but the environmental goal should be clearly present. So in December 2019, in the European Union was released the European Green Deal. And among the measures, there is the proposal to introduce a carbon border adjustment in the European Union. And in the frame of the EU recovery plan, the European Council has also agreed on the introduction of this carbon border adjustment and also on a levy on non-recycled plastic packaging waste. So these new EU resources are addressed to face budgetary problems while the climate policy objectives are reached. So the question that arises is whether the environmental goal the environmental goal or the revenue goal prevails. So when we are talking about the introduction of carbon taxes, or this could be also applicable to other green taxes, this carbon tax is aimed to obtain revenues because we are in this economical situation because of the COVID-19, to allow to reduce the government's deficit, but also to reduce the carbon release to the atmosphere. So it is essential that the clarity in the regulatory goal is clear to avoid conflicts of goals between the regulatory goal and the revenue goal. So even if this conflict may arise and there is a risk, or there may be a risk of that the fiscal goal prevails over the environmental goal, the idea of double dividend appears as a positive aspect of this link. So we are talking about this idea of double dividend. That means that green taxes can provide two benefits. On the one hand, the improvement of environmental quality, and on the other hand, the improvement of economic efficiency. So this means that the first dividend refers to the well-being resulting from the environmental improvement, while the second dividend refers to the reduction in the distortions of the revenue-raising tax system. Notwithstanding this, from the literature review, it can be said that environmental taxation does not always bring additional benefits, because a double dividend may arise if tax efficiency is improved along with environmental efficiency, which does not occur in general, but on specific cases. So that is to say that there are some specific situations where a certain degree of double dividend can be expected. Indeed, from an environmental perspective, the ideal environmental tax needs to reduce pollution, and it then needs to reduce the revenue yield. And precisely from a fiscal perspective, from the other perspective, the ideal environmental tax leads to a great deal of revenue. So in the European Union, as I have said at the beginning, the benefits expected with the recovery plan and also with this European Green Deal are, on the one side, addressed to generate green-owned resources that contribute to the recovery effort, but also to support the green transition, to support to the green transition of the EU economy and society. So some authors are talking about the idea of a European triple dividend, because it will be this improvement of the environmental quality. There will be as well this improvement of efficiency, because member states will be able, or they will have a space to cut more harmful taxes at the domestic level, for instance, labor taxes. But also the triple dividend appears because of the fact that the EU revenues are going to be used to finance European public goods. So for instance, the expansion of low carbon transport infrastructure within trans-European networks. However, it should be reminded that decisions in tax matters in the European Union requires unanimity. So this means that the 27 member states should be, should agree on the introduction of a carbon tax, or in general in tax matters. And precisely the European Committee of the Regions recognized in June 2019 that unanimity in taxation has hindered the implementation of certain European achievements in the 2030 climate and energy framework. So therefore, the fact that this requirement applies, so this means that unanimous decisions in tax matters are required, may hamper the implementation of green taxes in the European Union, such as, for instance, this proposal of introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU. So I'm just now moving to this specific proposal. So I'm going to focus on this carbon border adjustment that it's in working process. So as it is commonly held, effective carbon prices arise in explicit ways. So for instance, a carbon tax or emission trading systems, but also in an implicit way. According to the study released in 2013 by the OECD, carbon taxes are preferable to other policies, and normally they are considered as one of the most cost-effective means of reducing CO2 emissions. However, as you may know, carbon pricing policies are taking place at domestic level. So they vary from country to country, and this may incentivize that production moves to those regions with less strict climate measures. So actually carbon prices increase the production cost. So those territories with, where the cost of doing business is lower would be more attractive for firms, for companies. So with the aim to prevent the risk of carbon leakage, the introduction of a carbon border adjustment at the EU level was proposed. So this means that different policy options are being explored. And of course, the impact of this measure, in this idea of the double or even the triple dividend that some authors are talking about at the EU level, so will depend, the impact of this measure will depend on the design and also on the sectors covered by the instrument. And in particular, the sectoral scope is one of the three main aspects that need to be addressed when introducing a carbon border adjustment. So together with the sectoral scope, it should be considered the type of policy instruments. So it could be, for instance, a carbon tax on selected products, both on imported and domestic products, or it could be a new tax on imports, or even it could be the extension of the EU emissions trading system to imports. Also, together with the sectoral scope and also about the decision about, of the type of policy instrument, it should be determine the carbon content and also the carbon pricing of imported products with the aim to apply this adjustment with, when a product enters the European Union. So in regard of the first aspect, that is the type of policy instrument, the carbon border adjustment may apply to imports only or also to exports. So for instance, as a rebate on exports. In terms of efficiency in achieving the environmental goal, it seems that a CBA on imports seems more suitable. And actually, the current envisaged options by the European Commission to introduce this carbon border adjustment are only focusing on an adjustment on imports, which ensures that the price on these products reflects more accurately their carbon content. So in particular, and even if the Commission adoption is still pending, actually is expected for the second quarter of this year, so even if we are still waiting for the final decision or for the adoption of the European Commission, it seems that the carbon border adjustment will take the form of a carbon tax on imported products. Actually, this is what the respondents to the public consultation have answered, and also this is the opinion of the European Parliament, that it's that the carbon border adjustment should take the form of a carbon tax on imported products. So this would imply a charge or a levy on the imported products, taking into account the carbon content. So this means the carbon footprint. So as it is going to be set up as a border adjustment, it is important that importers should not, that they are not treated in a discriminatory way in comparison with EU producers. So this means that we should take into account World Trade Organization rules. So in this regard, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade allows taxing imported products with a charge equivalent to an internal tax. Of course, as this mechanism is going to work as an adjustment of the taxes imposed domestically on imported products, the levy could be higher if the carbon content is higher. And precisely in regard of the carbon content, we should take into account that we are talking about an equivalent charge. So for the determination of the equivalent charge, we should estimate the carbon content of both domestic and imported products. And here we should take especially care when we are measuring the carbon content as not to disadvantage imported products. When we are talking about the carbon content, products can have carbon content because they are produced using carbon or because their consumption may release CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. In the case of the carbon border adjustment in the European Union, the estimation of the carbon content will refer to the production process. However, there is no consensus on the approach that is going to be used for the calculating the carbon content. So this is an issue that should be answered in this adoption of the European Commission. So for instance, according to the public consultation that was released, the respondents have suggested that both direct and indirect emissions should be factored in, but also they have considered that the emissions should account for the whole value chain of products in different countries, and also that importers should have the possibility to demonstrate how the imported product was manufactured. Together with this public consultation and the different approaches that have been discussed, also the OECD has identified different approaches for determining the carbon content, to determine the CO2 emissions embodied in imported products. And for instance, the OECD has identified a product-based approach or a sector-based approach or an hybrid approach. So for instance, the product-based approach, which seems the more suitable one, tries to determine the carbon content in each imported product covered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. The final aspect that should be considered when introducing this carbon border adjustment scheme in the European Union is the sectoral scope. Actually, the European Green Deal refers to selected sectors. So the question is, okay, so which sectors are going to be covered? So in this case, so we can talk, or the measure may comprise, for instance, or may apply to those sectors that are more effective by the by the risk of carbon leakage, because actually the carbon border adjustment is like a reaction to this risk. So for instance, here we can talk about the mining of hard coal, the manufacture of sugar, or the manufacture of basic pharmaceutical products, among others. But also we can consider, as another possibility of the sectoral scope, those sectors that are regarded as particularly polluting. So this means, for instance, to consider those sectors that are already covered by the European Union emissions trading system, such as oil refineries, steel, or cement. This option could be in terms of administrative costs, in terms of, to avoid additional burdens. So it could be the easy one, because in such a way, we will, it will be restricted to already sectors that are already covered by this European trading system. And actually, the European Parliament has expressed its opinion on it. And according to the European Parliament opinion, this scheme should refer to all imported products covered, that they are already covered by this EU emissions trading system. And I would like to finish my presentation with a reference to the G20 meeting of last week. And in this meeting, the ministers have considered that international cooperation is essential to avoid that there are spillovers of some consequences because of the application of unilateral approaches. Actually, the fact that different tax policies are taken in different countries is one of the reasons that there is this risk of carbon leakage. And the ministers, as you can see in the second table, the second blue table, the ministers have stressed that a multilateral approach to tax policy and climate change is key to address successfully this global challenge. So the question that might arise is whether this attempt to a multilateral approach or to a multilateral agreement or consensus will be a push or a pause to the introduction of a carbon border adjustment scheme in the European Union, because according to the roadmap, the adoption of the European Commission is expected or is planned for the second quarter of the year, of this year. And well, so I think we are almost at the end of the second quarter. So we will see what would happen. So also that's all from my side. So many thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation of my colleagues and also for the debate after the presentations.
Congratulations, Professor Elizabeth. We think that you take a general approach on how to design a carbon tax. And we Brazilians hope that our government take place in these discussions, although the times are not so good for us in political and environment issues. So now we're gonna hear Professor Alison Christians, who is the H. Rewarder Stickman Chair in the Law of Taxation at the McGill University Faculty of Law, where she teaches and writes on national, comparative, and international tax law and policy. She focuses especially on the relationship between taxation and economic development, the role of government and non-government institutions and actors in the creations of tax policy norms and the intersection of taxation and human rights. She has written numerous articles, essays, and book chapters, as well as essays, columns, and articles in professional journals, and has been named one of the Global Tax 50 most influential individuals in international taxation. Recent research focuses on evolving international norms of tax cooperation and competition, the relationship between tax and sustainable development, the impact of technology on tax policy, and evolved conceptions of rights and taxation. Professor Christians also engaged on topics of law, of tax law and policy via her website, AlisonChristians.com, and on Twitter, Professor Christians. And it's a good website for students as well. I have gone to the website, and there are some piece of information good for students as well. And Professor Allison will talk about the connection of tax to sustainability. So, Professor Allison, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here with you. I'm glad that you find some things of use on my website. I'll try to keep adding content there for you. Let's see if I share my screen so you can see these slides. And as you said, I'm going to talk about the link between tax and sustainability. Well, I think we already saw that link in the presentation that Elizabeth gave us. Thank you so much for that presentation, Elizabeth, laying out what's going on in Europe. So we already know that things are happening and there must be some connection between tax and sustainability. And we usually see it in the idea of a carbon tax. And I'm gonna push against that idea a little bit in this presentation. So I start with this idea that non-sustainable goods and services externalize social and economic environmental costs. And this is an inefficiency that, that we're well aware of in the tax world. And if we go from the inefficiency, we compound that problem where we see that governments are reducing their tax even when revenue is needed to address externalities and provide infrastructure. Now, that's a problem because why are we doing that? Well, it's very common. You all know this as tax competition, and you can see the world trying to address that in some ways, but imperfectly. Okay, so we go from this inefficiency where non-sustainable goods externalize these costs and governments add to this problem by reducing tax where they actually need the revenue to address those things, to this overall market distortion where goods and services that internalize environmental costs are just not competitive. You're not going to be able to make things that are competitive if you can't take care of the environment in doing so. And so we all know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. We need solutions, and we need to figure out how to use tax policy to channel investment away from unsustainable stuff and put it in sustainable stuff. And the carbon tax has traditionally been maybe the best. I think you called it, Elizabeth, you called it the most efficient way to do this. And I'm not so sure. So I think we need to look at this one more time. So I bring us to this virtuous cycle between tax and sustainable development. And I want us to think about how these work symbiotically together in creating a virtuous cycle. So this is our ideal world, right? We think to ourselves, when we pay tax, what we want governments to invest. We want them not to take our tax money and throw it away, but to invest it in sustainable infrastructure. And if they do that, we believe that if governments do that, then our human and natural resources will be highly productive. And that's inherently good, that's intrinsically good, but it's also financially good because it creates profits. And it's a very virtuous cycle. When people and our natural resources are highly productive, the market is producing high profits, which we're very happy about because, well, profit is good and so on, but also because high profits produce taxes. And you can see the completion conclusion of this cycle that if we can come up with taxes, then we can see the cycle complete, that government will use those taxes to increase our well-being in our lives again, and we'll continue on that cycle. Now, this is our ideal cycle. Every government wants this. Every person wants this. Well, not everybody, not every government wants this, but everybody sort of has this idea of that this is what we're kind of striving for when we're trying to build good tax policy. And so what happens is we know that, well, actually governments misspend and people aren't highly productive even when they do have investment in them, and the markets don't produce profits. There's failures that, you know, happen in all kinds of ways. And the tax revenue, even when the market does produce profits, we don't figure out how to get the taxes out of it. So we don't actually complete the cycle. And basically everything goes wrong all the time. And we break our virtuous cycle. And so I know when we look at tax and we think, how do we use tax to get this cycle back? Like, where should we put our energy? We almost always focus on this little corner between the market producing high profits and the tax revenues abounding. And we think we just shine a spotlight on that corner and we focus on tax avoidance and tax evasion. Well, then we'll find our profits, we'll find our tax revenues, and we'll get that virtuous cycle going again. And the carbon tax kind of pokes at that idea somewhere else, but I think we're looking in the wrong place. I think we're we're missing something here between human natural resources being highly productive and the market producing high profits. Something's going wrong there in that market distortion I was talking about. And so, well, what are they? Well, I think what we are missing is that the market is working on all of this externalized costs that we're producing, and we have not dealt with that in tax policy, and we actually have to take aim at that. We have to look at that problem head on and not just wait for the consumer to make a choice to pick something other than the unsustainable choice because there's a carbon tax on it, but we need to take that idea and expand it further into the income tax. We need to be thinking about those externalized costs. Well, why do we have to think about that, or how can we think about that in tax? Well, you might know this man, Azad Razzouk. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But recently he said the following. He has been advocating, he's a clean energy advocate, and I'm sure that he's going to make his money and his business is in clean energy. So this is an advertisement for his own business model, but more power to him. I hope that he makes some progress on this, because this is what he says. He says, look, these environmental impacts that are happening all over the place, all these externalized costs, they have to get reflected in public company income statements. Because if we don't incorporate those costs, we're talking about massive risk of climate failure, which is going to put companies out of business. They're going to be worthless. If you don't reflect those risks of those impacts in your business statement, then your stated earnings are wrong. He says they're wrong. And I agree with him. They are wrong. And the problem that we have is that when those stated earnings are wrong, this error just flows right through into the tax system, where we then tax everything wrong because we're not correctly understanding where profits are deriving from, the source of profits, and what kinds of things are producing the income that we want to collect tax from. So this is sort of embodied in this idea that we're supposed to be trying to figure out how to tax income where value is created. And if value is created by externalizing costs, well, we need to count that. We need to figure out what that value is, and we need to understand the impact of that on our tax system. Okay, so here's the thing. If you, as a company, if you spend money to prevent and abate environmental destruction, then that money you spend shows up. But if you don't spend money and the thing happens that you didn't do to abate it, that crisis shows up. That's not on your books. We have to figure out how to get that cost into the bottom line for tax purposes. Okay, so, the smokestacks producing all kinds of pollution, you don't put a value on that in the corporate books, but we can figure out how much that costs us. We can figure out the risks of that more now than we ever could. I think that at one point, Elizabeth, in your presentation, you talked about the value chain or whole value chain analysis, and that's where we're going with this, right? There are environmental engineers working on figuring out the pricing of this kind of behavior all through the value chain of any given product. The carbon tax comes at the end and taxes the consumption. And what I want to do is go back into the value chain all the way back and find those externalized costs all the way along the value chain and try to sort out what kind of risks and what kind of abatement would be necessary to create a more sustainable alternative. Okay, so we could do more. We can figure out more now than we ever could in the past regarding these externalized costs. And so we can already see in some literature, some people are talking about, well, we should do this value life cycle analysis where we figure out all these externalized costs. And what we should do is, well, we could start with the consumption tax that we have, usually in Europe, the VAT, in Canada also, but some countries don't have a VAT, they have sales taxes, but consumption taxes. And if you take this consumption tax base and you add this life cycle assessment to it, then you could somehow figure out whether the VAT should be charged on a slightly higher price. And you'll see there's some literature about this damage. It's called a damage adjusted VAT. And that's what they're talking about. They're trying to sort out, can you just increase the consumption tax? But I think you do not get rid of unsustainable behavior by firms unless you get rid of the profits from unsustainable behavior by firms. And to get rid of the profits, you're not going to get that directly through a consumption tax or only through a consumption tax, but you might get it if you come at a consumption tax and an income tax together. You have them work together. So I'm with the VAT and the life cycle assessment for the damage adjusted VAT. And I also think a carbon tax beside that will cement that from the consumer's point of view and try to make consumers aware of the alternatives that are more sustainable. But I think we could go even further. I think we take that life cycle assessment and we add it to the income tax. When you take a life cycle assessment and you start figuring out the costs that would be incurred by a more sustainable firm, then you can work that through, and specifically you can work it through some pretty complex rules like the transfer pricing rules, but all through the income tax. And if you do that, then what you will find is that there is a lot of profit being generated that is actually externalized cost-based profit. What I mean to say is that you're going to find when you do life cycle assessment, you're going to find that a lot of things that we call profits are actually just the privatized portion of corporate ability to externalize costs to the public. And so if you add the life cycle assessment to the income tax, then you're going to come up with a portion of corporate profit that not only should be taxed, but it should be taxed fairly highly. That is, you could conceive that what we really need is a sustainable excess profits tax. We have to see these externalized costs as excess profits, something like a form of rent, and we should be taxing those away at the corporate income level. I will stop there because I know that my colleague Tarcisio, who's up next, will walk us through the sustainable excess profits tax a little further, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thanks.
Thanks, Professor Ellison. Unfortunately, my connection is not sustainable. And so I can't see the whole presentation, but I'm sure you have bring some ideas for us. Now we're gonna hear our Professor Tarcisio Diniz Magalhães, who is Professor of Law at the University of Antwerp and a researcher in digitalization and taxation at the Antwerp Tax Academic and the Digitax Center of Excellence. He has also been a course lecturer in tax policy and income taxation at the McGill University Faculty of Law. He is a former postdoctoral researcher in international taxation at McGill Law and IBFD. He holds doctor, master, and bachelors of law degrees, all obtained with honors at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, our UFMG, under merit-based critical theory of international tax law, published in 2019, and the reviewer, the Intertax, was awarded the Best Thesis of Law Prize, receiving honorable mention by the Brazilian government for its originality and relevance to scientific, technological, cultural, social, and innovation development. He also been a visiting scholar under merit-based scholarships at U Vienna, Institute for Austrian and International Tax Law, the Max Planck Society, Institute for Tax Law and Public Finance, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in 2020, he was nominated one of the 35 leaders of the future in taxation, Tax Coup. And Professor Tarcísio will talk about the sustainable excess profits tax proposal. So, Professor Tarcísio, you have 20 minutes for your presentation.
All right. Well, so thank you very much for this very nice presentation. Let me just start by saying how honored and humble I am to be invited to a Congress that is organized in Brazil, my home country. But not only that, organized by female lawyers who have been doing such an amazing work in Brazil, and that I also get to share a panel with two amazing scholars who are also female. So my contribution is definitely going to be minimal, but I just wanted to pick up on what Alison left off, which is this idea. And why don't I start sharing my PowerPoint? I think you can see it now, which is this idea of focusing on taxing profits instead of other things when it comes to trying to stop environmental damage. So as you can see on the slide, this comes from a proposal that Alison and I put together. It's available on SSRN. It's called the Case for Sustainable Excess Profits Tax. But the basic idea there is that we're trying to articulate an idea about how profits should be taxed when it comes to trying to avoid environmental damage instead of focusing on carbon taxes or prices or other things. And we're going to see that in a bit. So on my first slide, so what we have here is the tax approaches that we see on the horizon today. On one side, you see global proposals. So those are the main discussions that we have at the international level today. You see pillars 1 and 2. Those are the two ideas that the OECD is trying to push forward. Pillar 1 is basically a way to tax digital companies and reallocate digital profits to so-called market jurisdictions. Pillar 2 is the global minimum tax, something that was recently backed up by the US, by the new administration in the US, and that OECD has, at least in principle, reached an agreement on something around 15%. So this is the global discussion on taxation on one side. And then I put under there the gap tax. Gap tax is also an idea that Alice and I came up with, which basically follows the logic of pillars 1 and 2, just adding on to it the idea of taxing rents or profits from the pandemic or extra profits, super profits from multinational companies at a higher rate. So it basically follows the same idea of pillars 1 and 2 with just this little adjustment. If you look on the other side, so now you see proposals specifically targeting environmental damage or environmental impact. The most traditional way of trying to make companies stop polluting the environment through taxes has been to put a surtax on prices. So that's the first basic idea. And that's where we get the idea of a carbon tax. It's becoming very, very popular today. Elizabeth already mentioned this idea at the level of the European Union, but other countries are also discussing this. The idea of the carbon tax is basically to make products that use carbon or that incur carbon emission more expensive. So you put a tax on those products, on that economic activity, that the production of that economic activity, because you want it to stop. You want to stop people from consuming those products, or you want to stop companies from producing those products. So in a sense, the tax here works as a punishment, or as a, some would call it a sin tax. It's something that comes as a way to stop things from happening by making them more expensive. But precisely because of that, it is such a controversial tax to be put in place, because on the other hand, you're going to hear people complaining and saying, well, you're making things more expensive. Consumers don't want to pay higher prices. You're going to have a huge impact on the economy. So you're going to see this huge discussion on both sides. People that do want things to stop because the environment is being affected. We have to take action on that. But on the other hand, people advocating against these ideas because they would have an economic impact. Below the carbon tax, there's the so-called damage VAT. The damage VAT follows the same logic, but it's it uses the VAT of value-added tax, and it puts a higher rate for products that have a higher impact on the environment. And it does so by using the methodology that Alison mentioned in her presentation, called the life cycle analysis method, which looks into all the stages of a production of a product, and checks whether what the impact is along the supply chain, and then puts a price on that and uses the VAT to tax those products that have a bigger impact. But as Alison was saying before, we don't think this is the best way to try to use tax against environmental damage. And the reason why we don't think that is because we believe that on one hand, there's this problem with the political controversy behind those taxes, because people don't want them to increase prices. But on the other hand, we think that we should focus on profits, and profits that are being derived and extracted by polluting the environment, by contaminating rivers, or by dumping waste in places where you shouldn't be dumping waste. So you see on the other side, we have another idea, which is to focus on a surtax on rents. And I'll explain a bit what rents are. But the basic idea, there's already a tax in place around the world. Some countries use this tax, which is the resource rent tax, which basically focuses on taxing the extra profits the companies collect just by mining, by engaging mining activities, because in the mining sector, the demand for products is usually stable, so you can usually increase the price, and consumers are still going to continue buying. So companies extract a high profits from these activities, and some countries believe that they can put an extra tax on top of that, and that's what's called a resource rent tax. Our idea is the last one, the SAP tax, the Sustainable Excess Profits tax. This idea borrows from all these previous ideas. It borrows from the OECD pillars 1 and 2, because it looks into how to divide normal profits from extra normal profits or abnormal profits, different forms of profits. It borrows from the carbon tax, because what the SAP tax does basically is try to tax those same activities that the carbon tax is doing, but through the corporate income tax instead of using prices. It borrows from the damage VAT because it uses life cycle assessment to find those prices or to find the impact. And it borrows from the resource rent tax because it focuses on rent. So that's our basic idea. So what is it? What is our argument, and what is this thing that we're referring to that is rent, and what's the difference between that and profit? So we look into the economics literature, and look in the economics literature. What economists are going to say is that any profit that is in excess of economic costs is going to be called economic rent, right? So what are economic costs? Well, those are all costs involved in producing or making profit. So that's cost of labor, that's cost of capital, that's opportunity cost, the cost that you incur when you choose one form of investment instead of another, right? You lose one investment when you move to another one. So there's an opportunity cost there. Economists are going to say that everything that goes above that, that's rent. And because it is something that is going beyond all those costs involved in producing a profit, even the returns on capital of the investor, the normal returns on capital the investor is already expecting, those are bonuses or extra profits that theoretically, or at least that's what the economic theory is going to say, can be taxed all away without incurring in any inefficiencies. Well, another way to define rents is to say that rents arise every time a resource is accessed for less than its value. And the example, the simplest example that we can think of, and that economists would agree with, is that if you have people willing to work for $10 an hour and you pay them $12 an hour, that means that they're extracting $2 of rent from that engagement, from that relationship. On the other hand, if you pay them $8 an hour, that means that the employer is extracting $2 of rent. So every time some form of resource, could be labor, capital, could be natural resources, anything that is accessed for less than its real value, then that means that somebody is collecting rent. So to put in other words, our argument is that when a firm avoids costs by externalizing them to others, which is what happens when companies engage in unsustainable activities and pollute the environment, what they're basically doing is that they're extracting rents. They're specific and that are localized in the territory or in the country. And because of that, those rents could be taxed at much higher rates than the regular corporate income tax. And that should be done so mostly by the countries that are impacted by the activity. So, Elizabeth was mentioning before the issues that we see, for example, with the carbon tax when it comes to cross-border adjustments or economic efficiency. She mentioned something about the idea of having a double dividend. So our argument tries to avoid that, right? So using the corporate income tax to tax those environmental damages does not incur in border adjustments. There will be some issues with transfer pricing. That's I'll explain that in a bit. But there's no real reduction in the revenues because it doesn't affect, or at least theoretically, it shouldn't affect economic activity. So if on one side, one of the problems with the carbon tax is that because you want the economic activity to stop happening, you tax it at higher rates. Once people stop engaging in that economic activity, that means that you're going to have less collection of taxes. That doesn't really happen with our idea, because our idea is only focused on this concept of rent, which is something that goes beyond, or that investors would not take into account when they make their investment decisions. That's what economic theory says. That's our basic argument. So as I said in the beginning, one of the things that our proposal borrows from is the idea from pillar 1 and 2 that we can separate different forms of profits, right? This idea today is talking about normal, routine, and non-routine profits, and saying the non-routine profits part of it can be reallocated to market jurisdictions because they belong to the market. So we're making an argument that goes along the same line, which is to say that we can separate sustainable and unsustainable profits. So if you look at the slide now, this is trying to show the different processes of making profits. So we start with investing in government bonds, invest in the government, and that's what's called usually a risk-free form of investment. There's not much risk, right? But then the return is going to be very little, right? That's the minimum that you would invest, or the most reasonable that anyone would invest in, because below that, then you could lose money. So with a risk-free investment, you're guaranteed to get something, but it's not that much. But then investors want to get more, and that's going to vary among different approaches from investors. There are more conservative investors, less conservative investors. So the more conservative ones are going to invest in some corporate bond or something that has some risk, but not that much risk. But then they're going to have some return that is proportional to that form of risk. They could get the return. More less conservative investors are going to incur more risk, but then they can make much more profit. That's the logic of the market. That's what a well-functioning market looks like. And that's what we think that should be happening, right? And then we get to the point of this idea of a quasi-rent. This is an intermediary idea when economists say, well, a quasi-rent, it's not entirely rent. It's not this idea of this bonus that can be taxed all the way. There's still some investment decisions involved in getting those quasi rents. But the thing is, up until this point, the risk is being internalized by the investor, either low risk with lower return or high risk with higher return. But once the investor starts externalizing risk, which is what these companies do when they affect the environment, then we get to this idea of a true economic rent or a windfall. It's just something that falls for the investor. The investor is not profiting because it is assuming a lot of risk, but because it is passing on the risk to someone else, which is usually the local population or society in general, or even the planet. So how does this, so what we're trying to tax is that's the second part, the unsustainable part of profits. So how would the SAP tax work in practice? If you look at my slide now, this is a very simplified example of a transfer pricing situation. On the left-hand side, we have a manufacturer and distributor located in different countries. Let's say the stated cost of the product is $5. We assume here a full cost markup of 10%. So that means the transfer price between the manufacturer and distributor has to be at least $5.50. That's what transfer price is going to do. If the manufacturer sells for less than that, then tax authorities are going to come in and say, no, this is wrong. We have to adjust your price. So that leaves a taxable profit of 50 cents in state B. When it gets to state A, the distributor is going to sell that for $8, let's say. The cost is the cost of buying the product, $5.50. There is a taxable profit there of $2.50. This is traditional transfer pricing. What we're trying to do is just adjust the price using life cycle analysis, and then making sure that the country that is incurring all these impacts, that is suffering more with these impacts, with the environmental impacts, gets to collect more of the tax that can be reinvested towards correcting those problems. So you see on the right-hand side, the manufacturer is the same situation, but here we identify an externalized cost of $2. We use that methodology, and it says, well, this product has an externalized cost of $2. There's some institutes doing research, and one example is a bar of chocolate that needs to be $3 more expensive than what we buy today, because producing a bar of chocolate is very unsustainable. There are many studies that say things like that. So if you can identify something like this, what we would basically do is use a method in transfer pricing called location savings that comes from, it's usually adopted by some countries in the world. For example, China. India has also tried to implement this method. Basically, what we do is we include that externalized cost as the base to calculate what the price would be at the level of the manufacturer. So applying the same full cost markup of 10%, now we have a base which is 7 instead of 5. So that means that the transfer price has to be $5.70. This means that the price has also be adjusted at the level of the distributor. Now the cost there is $5.70. The final price stays the same. So see that we're not trying to change the price of the product like carbon tax would do. The difference is the taxable profit now in the distributor is $2.30 instead of $2.50, and at the level of the manufacturer is now $5.70. So there's more revenue at the level of the manufacturer where things are happening and the impact is taking place. This means that the corporate income tax could tax 50%, 50 cents of those $5 of that base, and then 20%, 20 cents would be the base for the SAP tax. Is this good tax policy? Well, we believe it is, and we believe it is because it follows the criteria for good tax policy. It is feasible because it uses income tax principles like transfer pricing. It builds on green taxes that we heard before. Elizabeth mentioned them. It can be implemented unilaterally. This is not a global proposal, and because it uses location savings, which is a traditional, well-established methodology in transfer pricing and life cycle analysis. It is equitable, and Alison already mentioned this, because it focuses on taxing rents, and this is fair because it realizes the ability to pay. And finally, it is also efficient. Tax economic rent is safe in economic competition terms, and it also corrects market failures. What we're trying to do is correct these failures, which is this externalization of cost. But instead of using a carbon tax or something like that, we're focusing on profits. So that's the basic idea. Thank you very much.
Congratulations, Tarcísio, and I apologize all for my connections problems. It's very good to see that we, in environment tax law, could work with some issues that can make the world better. And so this approach from Tarcísio with international tax law practices and some norms to improve the environment tax law, it's a good approach. So we have some minutes, and I think we can give about 5 minutes for Professor Elizabeth, for Professor Alison, and for Professor Tarcísio to final considerations. And if one of you would like to ask some questions from each other, we can do as well. So we'll give the Professor Alison and then to Professor Tarcísio. Professor Elizabeth.
Okay, Thank you, Daniel, Jyoti, for giving me the opportunity to talk. So I would like to congratulate Professor Christians and Tarcisio for their presentations, as well as for this paper. There were lots of ideas. I was taking notes as well. So, Professor Alison Christians were talking about alternatives. To find alternatives to the traditional technologies or traditional kind of businesses about that are based on carbon, and it was to my mind the idea that I totally agree with this. Of course, that we should find green alternatives, but sometimes, and well, especially if I'm taking into account Spain, that normally has been, the companies normally have been dependent, in terms of technology from outside, that sometimes the maturity of green technologies is not always, enough or sufficient to accomplish with these environmental goals. So maybe we can consider to provide or to grant incentives related to innovation in terms that companies are, they are able to adopt their, their traditional businesses to more green business ones. And also, I wanted to say something today, in today's presentation, but I didn't find enough information about this because yesterday afternoon, I read a new, a declaration of Ursula von der Leyen. She is the president of the European Commission, and she was saying that those who release CO2 emissions should pay. So this is actually, I think this is also related to the idea of your paper. And actually, when we are talking about environmental taxation, the justification for environmental taxation is normally, the polluter pays principle, which is like the mantra principle when we are talking about environmental law. And it was also, I have also really enjoyed the idea of, the last idea of Tarcisio presentation, this connection with the ability to pay principle, because I think there is a intrinsic connection between the polluter pays principle and the ability to pay principle when we are talking about environmental taxation. And finally, I have two more comments to make, because I think it was Professor Alison Christians that she was talking about the destiny of the tax revenues that we are collecting with these green taxes, which is always, an issue, because it is, I think it's important that when these revenues are addressed to the green transition, that to this goal. And this is why some authors at the European level were talking about this idea of the triple dividend, because this seems it is going to be the first time, if this carbon border adjustment finally is adopted, that the revenues are going to be, integrated in the EU budget, and they are going to be used to finance public European goods. So this is like a positive remark that can make the difference from other tax policies in the European Union. And finally, so you were saying, Alison, that we can't figure out how much it costs when we are talking about the population. Yes, so I totally agree with this. So normally, from my experience, when I have been studied some green taxes in Spain, normally proxies are used to determine, the level of, how much a company or a firm is polluting or releasing CO2 emissions. Yeah, so I think that's all from my side in this second time.
Thanks a lot. Professor Alison, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for those, or Professor Garcia, I should call you, for those ideas. So I wonder if you would tell me a little bit more about this earmarking in Europe. So when Europe says they're going to use the taxes raised from the border adjustment for public goods, what does that look like? Like, is that there's a fund that's for cleaning up the environment, or like, what does that look like? And I'm just curious, how does one country police another when you decide that you need to do that earmarking. I think that's an interesting idea, and I'm curious how that would actually work.
Shall I answer now, or?
Yeah, I think let's have a little conversation about it.
Okay. So yes, so this is like the idea. So when there is this proposal, so the idea, I mean, because this was, I mean, the carbon border adjustment was proposed at the end of 2019, and with the pandemic situation, all the policies were like accelerated because of the crisis. So in May, June of last year is when this EU recovery plan was released. And actually the name is like something like the recovery plan to the digital and the green transition. So together with also with the introduction of a carbon border adjustment, it is expected that a digital tax levy is introduced at the EU level. Well, now it's like in a standby situation because we are waiting for the decision of pillars 1 and 2.
Yeah.
So the idea is that all the revenues that are going to be generated with these new taxes are going to be integrated in the EU budget. So it is supposed that this is going to be used for promoting the green transition at the EU level. So it seems like there is going to be like a connection between the origin of the revenues. I mean, if these revenues are coming from a green situation, I mean, from the green taxation, so they are going to be addressed for this. However, this is, I mean, there are some skepticisms in this regard, because together with this carbon border adjustment, it has been also introduced in January 2021, so 6 months ago, a tax on plastics. Well, it's not like a tax, it's a levy that states should pay to the EU budget. So this means that now states should see how they are going to collect this. So maybe, for instance, in Spain, it is in process now to introduce a plastic tax. So probably this plastic tax will be the way to collect this levy that later the country should pay to the EU budget. So when this proposal was made, for instance, some plastic associations, I mean, European plastic associations, they were very concerned because they were considering that this was not like an optimal or a good measure to actually address the goal of reducing the generation of plastics. So I think we should see, because I mean, the idea is that, for instance, as I have said before, that the revenue arising from this carbon border adjustment is, for instance, used to the expansion of low carbon transport infrastructure within the Trans-European network. So this is like the idea. So I think we should weigh how this is going to be materialized. But I think, I mean, like the idea from the theoretical perspective, I think is the good way. So now we should go to the next stage, to the implementation of this measure.
Yeah, it's really well said. I think that's a really interesting set of developments, partly because it is directed at something that is really important now, but also because it goes to this very heart of the idea of, you know, what is the purpose of our tax system? What are we trying to accomplish with it? Is it, you know, raising revenue for what? You know, and when you think about that, and when you try to make that explicit link, there's some political, obviously there's always some political back and forth about that. And so you have to contend with that. You know, you'll have on one side people think that all taxes are terrible and you should just get rid of them, and innovation and all of that. And that's, you know, you've got to let the market flourish and all that. But when there's a market, like a major market distortion going on, and that's really what we're talking about now, you know, you really count on your regulatory systems to address it. And when they don't, then the market just becomes so out of connection with what you actually want in terms of the society you're trying to build, that, you know, trying to get back involves this conversation. So I really appreciate you laying that out. Thank you for that. And then I wanted to just say one other thing about, you talked about incentivizing, maybe we should be thinking about giving credits or incentivizing those who are sustainable. And, I'm as somebody who's been in this business for a long time, I've heard a lot of people tell me we should give a credit to do, this, that, or the other thing. And we should be crediting lots of things in the tax system to incentivize behaviors. And I agree, but I want to do it in a different way. What I want to do is, this is why the excess profits tax idea, right? So the idea is that if you excess profits tax, if you excess tax, yeah, exactly. You disincentivize, it's like a credit because you don't have to pay that extra tax that the unsustainable competitor does have to pay. But I recognize there's a very interesting social problem with me, suggesting that you ought to feel those two things the same way, right? Like you just don't feel the not having to pay a tax the same way you do the being given a gift in the form of a credit. So I'm interested in that sociological, problem that we have whenever we're trying to figure out how to get taxpayers to do things in our collective interest in our well-being, the interest of our collective well-being, or something like that. So I appreciate all of those thoughts, and I just think that when it comes to the environment, when it comes to tax, you're talking about two things that people don't really want to talk about. They don't want to talk about the climate. It's a very big problem. It's very scary. And we have one experiment going on. And if our experiment goes badly, we can't start the experiment over and do it a different way. And it's very scary. And people don't like taxes. No matter how much we nerd out and love taxes, people don't like taxes. And so when we put those two together, I think people just start to get a little nervous and uncomfortable. And maybe one of the things that we can do is just try to figure out how to help people understand carbon taxes, or in our case, the sustainable excess profits tax, as a way to invest in the society that we want, in the communities that we want, in the future that we want. And that's I think our challenge.
Well, I can jump.
Professor Alonso, it's a good thought that, sorry. Tarcísio?
Yeah, okay. I think you can hear you now. Oh, okay. Well, let me just jump in this discussion, because this is so this idea of either taxing more the unsustainable companies or providing a credit for the sustainable ones, right? The two sides of this coin. This is very interesting because recently I've been discussing with a colleague here the Belgian approach to sustainability and tax, and one measure that they have in place is this idea of denying deductions that you would usually have in the corporate income tax for unsustainable products. So for example, if a company buys cars, usually that's an expense that would be deducted from the corporate income tax. So then you deny if the car that they're using is not a green car, right? And that's all that raises this same discussion, right? We're not really taxing them more. It kind of feels like a punishment, right? It kind of feels like they don't like what's happening, but it's not that you're taxing them more. You're just denying the deduction that they used to have before, so they start doing something else. And I think that's kind of the same lines that we're trying to think the excess profits tax, which is to focus on this idea of rents, of extracting these rents and profits. So I think there's a lot of room there to explore the corporate income tax much more than there's other forms of taxes. Elizabeth, you're talking about this third dividend, which is going to be reinvested in Europe with this border adjustment tax. So one of the things that Alice and I worry about, taking a more international or global perspective, is who's collecting the tax at the end of the day, and that's why we want to make adjustments at the bottom, or where the manufacturing is mostly taking place, because that's where most of the impact is happening. Because and I think that's the problem with these other proposals, with border tax adjustments, with the VAT. If you see, there's a manual handbook by the UN. There's one on carbon tax that hasn't been released yet, but there's one on extractive industries. And one of the first things that the UN, for developing countries, one of the first things the UN says there is that, look, the VAT's not going to give you much revenue because you're exporting, right? So it's all exempt. So that's why we we prefer to look at the corporate income tax because then the developing country where all the mining is happening, that's where they can collect, and that's why they have to use these other things like resource rent tax, instead of focusing on consumption, focusing on these border adjustments. So this third dividend is a very interesting idea, but taking more of a global perspective, it's something that would come in as part of the European budget for reorganizing the economy at the level of Europe, but it wouldn't have much impact on what's happening outside Europe in terms of raising revenues for sustainability. And what we think should be done is to focus on places where sustainability deficits are higher and where the impact mostly takes place. You said, for example, the polluter pay principle. So I think we would agree with that idea, but we also care about not only making the polluter pay, but where the polluter is paying. I guess that's one of the main points. I guess those are my comments.
Okay, I think Daniel's connections is really poor now, and he's not here anymore. So I will make my final comments of this panel. And it was a great time being here today. We have many ideas to bring to the debate here in Brazil about our tax reform that unfortunately does not involve climate changes or carbon tax or anything related to environmental changes and the issues that we debated here today. So I think we have many ideas, and I was very happy to hear Professor Alison Christians saying that people don't like taxes, people don't like to follow the rules about environment, because here in Brazil we have the same problems, of course, especially now with our government. So it's very good to know that it's not issue of only here in Brazil, it's international. So it's very difficult to be an expert and try to make people believe that this is the only way to the future, so we can have a future. And I would like to now call Daniel again. Do you have anything to add, Daniel? I don't know. I don't.
No. I'm just apologize for the. Yeah. And I thank you, Nina and Lydia, for the invitement.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. And it was an honor being here today. I apologize for any technical issues we've had. So I'd like to thank again to Professor Alison, Professor Elizabeth, and Professor Tarcísio, and Daniel as well. And I wish we had more time, but we don't. So I declare this panel finished. And I will give some warnings, not warnings, but some statements about tomorrow's panels, but in Portuguese now. Bom, para quem está assistindo, amanhã vai ser o último dia do nosso evento. Então, teremos ainda mais 3 mesas a partir das 8h30 da manhã. E espero todos e todas lá. Oh, thank you very much. Bye, bye.